Ladies and gentlemen, when we think of the Wild West, what comes to mind? Gunfights at high noon, fearless cowboys, ruthless outlaws, and sheriffs bringing justice to lawless towns. Hollywood and dime novels have shaped our vision, but today we will journey beyond the myths and discover the true history of the American frontier. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Old West is that gunfights were an everyday occurrence. In reality, towns often had stringent gun control laws. Places like Dodge City and Tombstone required visitors to check in their firearms upon arrival. The famous wild towns actually had less violence than cities in the eastern United States at the time. For instance, New York and Boston had much higher crime rates compared to frontier towns, which were small, tightly knit communities where lawbreaking was difficult to get away with. Another popular myth is that outlaws ruled the West with an iron fist, robbing banks and terrorizing settlers without consequence. While there were certainly criminals, their impact has been exaggerated by folklore and Hollywood films. Infamous figures like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy did commit robberies, but the frequency of such crimes was much lower than we are led to believe. In fact, the first recorded bank robbery in the West didn't happen until 1866, decades after settlement had begun. Local law enforcement, U.S. Marshals, and even private security agencies like the Pinkerton Detective Agency played a crucial role in maintaining order. Many notorious outlaws were either captured or driven into hiding by these authorities. Additionally, Western communities often relied on vigilantism, forming groups to deal with criminals when law enforcement was unavailable. While these vigilante actions could sometimes be harsh, they were not the free-for-all, blood-soaked spectacles seen in movies. Beyond crime and punishment, the West was also a place of governance and civilization. Towns had mayors, courts, and legal systems that were often quite effective in resolving disputes. Land ownership, trade agreements, and contracts were taken seriously, and many settlers preferred to settle conflicts legally rather than resort to violence. The reality is that the West was not a lawless, chaotic land where might made right. It was a place where people worked to build structured communities, enforce justice, and create opportunities. While violence did occur, it was far from the dominant way of life. The image of constant shootouts and outlaw rule is a Hollywood invention, not historical fact. When we hear the word cowboy, we often picture rugged, fearless gunslingers riding across the open plains, engaging in duels, and living lives of adventure. However, the real cowboys of the American West were far from the romanticized figures portrayed in movies and novels. Instead of being outlaws or professional gunfighters, most cowboys were hardworking laborers who spent long hours tending to cattle, navigating harsh landscapes, and enduring extreme weather conditions. The primary role of a cowboy was to manage and move large herds of cattle from one place to another. This process, known as a cattle drive, required immense skill, patience, and physical endurance. Cowboys had to wake up before dawn, saddle their horses, and spend the entire day riding alongside thousands of cattle, ensuring they stayed on the correct path. The job was exhausting, dangerous, and monotonous, often lasting weeks or even months. One of the greatest challenges cowboys faced was the unpredictable nature of the environment. They had to endure scorching summers, freezing winters, and powerful storms while out on the open plains. Stampedes were another serious threat. If something startled the herd, thousands of cattle could suddenly start running, trampling everything in their path. A cowboy had to react quickly, using his horse and rope to try and regain control of the herd before disaster struck. Despite their tough and rugged lifestyle, cowboys were not as heavily armed as often depicted. Many carried a revolver, but their primary tools were lassos, whips, and knives, which were used for herding cattle, not gunfighting. The idea of cowboys constantly engaging in gun battles is a Hollywood creation rather than historical reality. In truth, most cowboys tried to avoid conflict, as their job was dangerous enough without adding unnecessary violence. Another overlooked aspect of cowboy life is its diversity. Many cowboys were African American, Mexican, or Native American, yet history books and movies often ignore their contributions. Mexican vaqueros, for example, played a crucial role in shaping cowboy culture. Many of the skills, tools, and even clothing associated with cowboys, such as the wide-brimmed hat, lasso, and chaps, originated from Mexican traditions. Similarly, Black cowboys made up about 25% of the workforce, yet their stories remain largely untold. Living conditions for cowboys were harsh. During cattle drives, they slept outside on the ground, with only a thin blanket or bedroll for warmth. Food was simple, usually beans, biscuits, and salted meat cooked over an open fire. They worked from sunrise to sunset with very little rest, often earning only $25 to $40 a month, a modest wage even for the time. Despite these hardships, many cowboys took pride in their work and developed a strong sense of camaraderie with their fellow ranch hands. They had to rely on one another for survival, which led to the formation of tight-knit groups that functioned almost like families. Storytelling, music, and jokes helped pass the time during long nights on the trail, and traditions such as rodeos emerged as a way to showcase their skills and entertain one another. The real cowboy was not a lawless gunslinger, but rather a tough, resilient worker who played a crucial role in shaping the American West. Their job was dangerous, exhausting, and far less glamorous than the myths suggest. When discussing the Wild West, much of the attention is given to cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen, but the true story of the frontier cannot be told without acknowledging the Native American tribes who had lived on the land for centuries before settlers arrived. The real Wild West was not an empty wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was home to thriving indigenous civilizations with rich cultures, complex societies, and well-established territories. Before westward expansion, Native American tribes such as the Lakota, Apache, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Navajo had vast networks of trade, diplomacy, and conflict among themselves. They had their own laws, traditions, and ways of life that were deeply connected to the land. However, as more settlers moved westward in search of land, gold, and opportunity, these tribes faced devastating consequences. The arrival of European settlers and the U.S. government's policies led to violent conflicts, broken treaties, and forced removals. One of the most infamous policies was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced many tribes off their ancestral lands. As settlers and railroads pushed further west, the government often ignored agreements it had made with indigenous nations. The discovery of gold in places like the Black Hills, which was sacred to the Lakota people, led to even more encroachments and conflicts. The so-called Indian Wars between the U.S. military and Native American tribes lasted for decades, with famous battles such as the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where the Lakota and Cheyenne, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated General Custer and his troops. However, despite occasional victories, Native American tribes were constantly pressured by an overwhelming force that had more resources, advanced weapons, and growing numbers of settlers backing them. One of the most tragic events in this struggle was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children in South Dakota. This marked the symbolic end of Native American armed resistance, as most tribes were either defeated or forced onto reservations by the late 19th century. Life on these reservations was harsh. Land was often unsuitable for farming, resources were scarce, and government policies attempted to strip Native Americans of their cultural identity through forced assimilation, including sending children to boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages. Despite these hardships, Native American resilience and resistance have remained strong. Many traditions, languages, and cultural practices survive despite efforts to erase them. Today, indigenous communities continue to fight for their rights, land, and recognition, proving that their history did not end with the closing of the frontier. The story of the Wild West is incomplete without acknowledging the Native American perspective. While cowboys, lawmen, and settlers shaped the American frontier, the Native American experience is a crucial and often overlooked part of this history. Their contributions, struggles, and enduring legacy deserve to be remembered as we seek to understand the true history beyond the myths and legends. The traditional image of the Wild West often portrays it as a man's world, filled with rugged cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen shaping the frontier. However, this depiction overlooks the significant role women played in building and sustaining Western communities. Women in the Old West were not just passive observers or damsels in distress, waiting to be rescued. They were pioneers, entrepreneurs, ranchers, doctors, teachers, and even sharpshooters who played a crucial role in shaping the frontier. One of the most important contributions of women in the West was their role in establishing homes and communities. Life on the frontier was incredibly harsh. Families had to endure extreme weather, food shortages, and the constant threat of disease. Women were responsible for much of the daily labor that kept households and farms running. They planted crops, raised livestock, cooked meals, made clothing, and cared for children, often with little or no outside help. Their resilience and adaptability were vital for survival. Beyond the household, many women actively participated in the workforce. Unlike in the East, where rigid social norms often restricted women's roles, the frontier offered opportunities for those willing to work hard. Women became ranchers, taking over cattle operations when their husbands were away or had died. Some even worked as cowhands themselves, riding horses, herding cattle, and enduring the same grueling conditions as men. Women also played a significant role in medicine and education. In many frontier towns, trained doctors were scarce, and women often stepped in as healers, midwives, and nurses, providing medical care to settlers and Native Americans alike. Some women, like Dr. Susan Anderson, became fully licensed physicians, treating patients in remote areas where medical professionals were in short supply. Similarly, women took on the responsibility of teaching, helping to establish schools and educate children in isolated communities. Entrepreneurial women also left their mark on the Wild West. Many opened businesses such as general stores, hotels, and restaurants, serving both settlers and travelers. Some, like Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary, ran delivery services, carrying mail and supplies across dangerous territories. Others, such as Clara Brown, a former enslaved woman, became successful business owners and philanthropists, helping newly freed African Americans settle in the West. One of the most overlooked aspects of women's contributions to the Wild West is their role in law enforcement and self-defense. Some women became bounty hunters, detectives, or even outlaws. Figures like Belle Starr and Pearl Hart gained notoriety as female bandits, while others, such as Stagecoach Mary, were known for their ability to handle weapons and defend themselves in a dangerous and unpredictable world. Women also played a critical role in shaping the legal and political landscape of the West. Many Western territories and states granted women the right to vote long before the rest of the country. Wyoming became the first U.S. state to allow women to vote in 1869, followed by other Western states, such as Colorado and Utah. These early victories helped pave the way for the national women's suffrage movement, leading to the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Despite their immense contributions, many of these women's stories have been overshadowed by the myth of the Wild West as a land dominated by men. In reality, the frontier was a place of opportunity and hardship for everyone, regardless of gender. Women's resilience, bravery, and hard work were just as crucial to the development of the West as the more famous exploits of cowboys and gunslingers. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 set off one of the greatest migrations in American history, transforming not only the West, but also the entire country. What began as a small find at Sutter's Mill quickly exploded into a full-scale gold rush, drawing hundreds of thousands of people from across the United States and around the world. The promise of wealth and opportunity fueled a massive movement of people, leading to the rapid development of towns, the expansion of infrastructure, and significant social and cultural changes. Before the gold rush, California was a sparsely populated region, mostly inhabited by Native American tribes and a small number of Mexican settlers. However, when word spread that gold had been discovered, people from all walks of life, farmers, merchants, soldiers, and even entire families, packed up their belongings and traveled westward in search of fortune. By 1849, tens of thousands of people had arrived, giving rise to the term 49ers, referring to those who came during this peak year of migration. The journey to California was long and treacherous. Many traveled by wagon along the Oregon and California trails, enduring harsh conditions, disease, and the constant threat of attacks. Others took the dangerous sea route, sailing around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America or crossing the deadly jungles of Panama to reach the Pacific coast. Those who survived the journey arrived to find a chaotic, booming frontier where makeshift mining camps sprang up overnight. Life in the goldfields was far from the glamorous adventure many had imagined. Miners worked long hours in grueling conditions, panning for gold in icy rivers or digging deep into the earth with crude tools. Most found little more than dust, while a lucky few struck rich veins that could make them wealthy overnight. However, with so many people rushing to California, competition was fierce and conflicts over claims often turned violent. The gold rush also had a devastating impact on Native American communities. As thousands of settlers flooded into California, indigenous lands were taken, and traditional ways of life were destroyed. Many Native Americans were forced from their homes, while others were killed in violent conflicts or succumbed to diseases brought by the newcomers. In just a few decades, California's indigenous population was reduced by nearly 90%, making the gold rush one of the most tragic chapters in Native American history. As gold fever spread, the effects of the rush extended far beyond California. New cities like San Francisco, which was a small village in 1848, exploded into a major port and economic center. Banks, railroads, and businesses flourished as the demand for goods and services skyrocketed. The sudden wealth also attracted criminals, leading to the rise of law enforcement agencies and vigilante justice in an attempt to maintain order. The influx of people from around the world made California one of the most diverse regions in America. Chinese immigrants arrived in large numbers, playing a vital role in both mining and railroad construction. Mexican, European, and African American settlers also contributed to the changing landscape. However, racial tensions were high, and discriminatory laws were often passed to limit the rights of non-white miners. Chinese miners, in particular, faced heavy taxation and violent attacks, yet they continued to work and build communities that would leave a lasting impact on the West. While the gold rush eventually declined as major deposits were exhausted, its legacy endured. It accelerated the push for California statehood, leading to its admission to the Union in 1850. It also fueled technological advancements, such as hydraulic mining and large-scale industrial extraction methods, which would later be used in other parts of the country. The sudden wealth and rapid expansion of the economy helped lay the foundation for the modern American West. In the end, the gold rush was about more than just gold. It reshaped the nation's economy, altered its demographics, and left behind a history of both opportunity and exploitation. It remains one of the most defining events of the 19th century, a moment that captured the hopes, struggles, and ambitions of those who dared to chase their dreams into the unknown. The expansion of the railroad was one of the most revolutionary developments in the history of the American West. Before railroads, traveling across the vast frontier was an arduous and dangerous journey. Settlers, traders, and gold prospectors had to endure months of treacherous travel by wagon, horseback, or even on foot, facing harsh weather, rough terrain, food shortages, and the constant threat of attacks from outlaws or hostile groups. The completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 changed everything, turning what was once a grueling months-long journey into a matter of days. Before the railroads, most Western settlements remained isolated, with little connection to the rest of the country. The arrival of the railroad brought an economic boom, allowing for the rapid transport of goods, people, and livestock across vast distances. Farmers could now send their crops and cattle to markets in the east, leading to the rise of massive ranching and farming industries. Towns that were once small and struggling grew into thriving hubs of commerce, and new settlements sprang up along the rail lines, bringing in a wave of immigrants and entrepreneurs seeking new opportunities. The railroad was also instrumental in the rise of industries such as mining and timber. Gold, silver, and other valuable minerals could now be transported efficiently, fueling the growth of Western cities and attracting even more settlers. Logging operations expanded as lumber was needed to build the booming towns and railroads themselves. The West was no longer a distant, isolated land. It was now fully connected to the rest of the nation, fueling the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand from coast to coast. However, this rapid expansion came at a cost, especially for Native American tribes. The railroad cut through their lands, disrupting traditional hunting grounds and leading to increased conflicts. The buffalo, a vital resource for many indigenous communities, was nearly driven to extinction due to overhunting by railroad workers and passengers who shot them for sport. As settlers followed the railroads westward, Native American tribes were forced onto reservations, and their way of life was permanently altered. The construction of the railroads themselves was a monumental feat, built largely by immigrant laborers who faced extreme hardships. Thousands of Chinese immigrants, along with Irish and African American workers, played a crucial role in laying the tracks, enduring brutal conditions, low wages, and dangerous work environments. Many lost their lives due to accidents, avalanches, and attacks, yet their contributions were vital to the success of the railroad system. Despite their efforts, these workers often faced discrimination, with laws and policies limiting their rights even after the railroads were completed. Railroads also played a major role in shaping the cultural identity of the West. They brought in waves of settlers, leading to the development of towns that would later become major cities. They fueled tourism, with wealthy Easterners taking rail trips to see the untamed frontier, and they even contributed to the spread of law enforcement and governance, making it easier to send federal troops and officials into previously hard-to-reach areas. By the late 19th century, the West was no longer a remote and lawless wilderness. It had been fully integrated into the national economy, thanks in large part to the railroads. They had transformed the landscape, boosted industries, and forever changed the way people moved and lived. The iron tracks that once symbolized opportunity and progress also carried the weight of displacement and destruction, making the history of railroads in the West one of both triumph and tragedy. The Wild West is often portrayed as a land of lawlessness, where gunfights were a daily occurrence, outlaws roamed freely, and justice was delivered at the barrel of a gun. While there were certainly moments of chaos, the reality was much more complex. Law and order in the West was shaped by a mix of frontier justice, corrupt officials, and communities trying to maintain peace in a rapidly growing and unpredictable land. In the early days of westward expansion, many towns had little to no formal law enforcement. Settlers and miners often arrived before government institutions could be established, leading to a system of self-policing. In many places, vigilante groups formed to enforce order where no official authorities existed. While some of these groups were well-intentioned, others operated as little more than gangs, using their power to settle personal grudges and impose their own version of justice. As settlements grew, towns began appointing sheriffs and marshals to enforce the law. Some of these lawmen, like Wyatt and Bat Masterson, became famous for their role in high-profile shootouts and clashes with criminals. However, being a lawman in the West was not always about chasing outlaws. It often involved settling disputes over land, managing drunken bar fights, and keeping the peace among rival factions. The line between lawman and outlaw was sometimes blurred, as some sheriffs and marshals had previously been criminals themselves. Corruption was widespread, especially in boomtowns that sprang up overnight due to gold or silver discoveries. With large amounts of money flowing through these towns, bribery and backroom deals were common. Many lawmen were on the payroll of wealthy businessmen or criminal organizations, turning a blind eye to illegal activities in exchange for protection or financial gain. In some cases, entire towns were controlled by outlaw gangs who held more power than the local sheriff. One of the biggest challenges in maintaining law and order was the sheer vastness of the frontier. The federal government had little control over many parts of the West, and U.S. Marshals, who were responsible for enforcing federal law, often had to travel hundreds of miles between settlements. This made it easy for outlaws to escape justice simply by crossing a county or territorial line. Bandits and fugitives frequently took advantage of these gaps in the legal system, evading capture by disappearing into the wilderness. Not all law enforcement officials were corrupt or ineffective. Some worked tirelessly to bring stability to their communities, often risking their lives in the process. Figures like Bass Reeves, one of the first black U.S. Marshals, became legendary for capturing hundreds of fugitives while operating in some of the most dangerous territories. Reeves, who was a former slave, was known for his clever disguises, fearless pursuit of criminals, and commitment to justice, making him one of the most effective lawmen in Western history. Another major factor in the struggle for law and order was the presence of famous outlaw gangs, such as Jesse James and his gang, Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch, and Billy the Kid and his associates. These criminals often became folk heroes, romanticized for their daring robberies and escapes from the law. However, their real-life crimes, bank heists, train robberies, and murders left a trail of destruction. The efforts to capture or kill these outlaws often resulted in bloody shootouts, reinforcing the idea of the West as a violent and dangerous place. Despite the many challenges, law and order in the West gradually improved as territories became states, infrastructure expanded, and communities developed stronger legal systems. The introduction of the railroad, the telegraph, and a more organized judiciary helped bring stability to once lawless regions. The romanticized image of the Wild West as a place where guns ruled and justice was arbitrary is only part of the story. In reality, the frontier was a constantly evolving landscape where the forces of law, corruption, and survival clashed in complex and unpredictable ways. The story of the Wild West is incomplete without acknowledging the struggle of Native American tribes who faced relentless displacement, broken treaties, and violent conflicts as settlers pushed westward. For centuries, indigenous peoples had lived on these lands, developing rich cultures, traditions, and ways of life deeply connected to nature. However, as the U.S. government and settlers expanded their reach, Native Americans found themselves increasingly forced from their homelands, leading to some of the most tragic and violent episodes in American history. Before European settlers arrived in large numbers, the Great Plains, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest were home to a vast number of indigenous nations, including the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, Comanche, Nez Perce, and many others. These tribes had complex societies, political structures, and economies based on trade, hunting, and agriculture. Many were nomadic, following the bison herds that provided food, clothing, and tools, while others built permanent settlements and engaged in farming. As westward expansion accelerated in the 19th century, tensions between Native Americans and settlers grew. The U.S. government frequently negotiated treaties that promised Native tribes land and protection in exchange for peace, but these agreements were often broken whenever gold, land, or resources were discovered. Native lands were seized, and tribes were forced onto reservations, often in harsh and unfamiliar environments that made survival difficult. One of the most significant conflicts of this period was the series of Indian Wars, a collection of battles and skirmishes between native tribes and U.S. forces. Some of the most well-known clashes included the Sand Creek Massacre, 1860, for a brutal attack in which Colorado militia forces slaughtered over 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, including women and children, despite their attempts to surrender. The Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, also known as Custer's Last Stand. This battle saw a coalition of Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeat the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry under General George Custer. While it was a major victory for Native Americans, it provoked harsher military responses from the U.S. government. The Nez Perce War, 1877, led by Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce tribe attempted to flee to Canada to escape forced relocation but was ultimately captured just 40 miles from the border. Chief Joseph's famous speech, "I will fight no more forever," became a symbol of Native American resistance and suffering. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890, one of the final major conflicts, where U.S. soldiers killed over 250 Lakota Sioux, many of them women and children, in a devastating show of force that effectively ended large-scale Native resistance. Beyond the battlefield, Native Americans were subjected to devastating policies aimed at erasing their cultures and identities. The Indian Removal Act, 1830, and later policies such as the Dawes Act, 1887, sought to force Native peoples to assimilate into European American society by breaking up tribal lands into individual allotments. Many children were taken from their families and placed in government-run boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions. The goal was to civilize them, but in reality, it stripped generations of their heritage and way of life. One of the most tragic aspects of Native American displacement was the destruction of the bison. The U.S. government and settlers engaged in widespread slaughter of these animals, knowing that by eliminating the primary food source of many Plains tribes, they could force Native Americans onto reservations. From a population of millions, bison numbers dwindled to just a few hundred by the end of the 19th century, marking an ecological and cultural catastrophe. Despite these hardships, Native American communities demonstrated incredible resilience. They resisted forced removals, preserved their traditions, and fought to maintain their sovereignty. Today, many tribes continue to reclaim their identities, revitalize their languages, and fight for recognition and rights that were long denied to them. The myth of the Wild West often overlooks or misrepresents the Native American experience, reducing it to simplistic narratives of savagery versus civilization. But the real history tells a deeper, more painful story, one of struggle, betrayal, and endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. The popular image of the Wild West often portrays women as helpless figures in need of rescue, but the reality was far different. Women in the West were tough, resourceful, and played crucial roles in shaping frontier society. From homesteaders and ranchers to businesswomen, doctors, and outlaws, these women defied traditional expectations and helped build the communities that transformed the American frontier. In many cases, life in the West offered women more opportunities and independence than in the more rigid societies of the East. With few established laws and institutions, frontier towns required hard work from everyone, regardless of gender. Women often managed households, farmed the land, raised livestock, and even ran businesses, all while enduring the harsh conditions of the frontier. One of the most common roles for women was that of the homesteader. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged settlers to claim land in the West, and thousands of women took advantage of this opportunity, either alongside their families or as independent landowners. These women had to be incredibly self-sufficient, building homes, growing crops, and fending off natural disasters, disease, and sometimes hostile encounters with outlaws or raiding parties. Many homesteading women became skilled with firearms, not just for self-defense but also for hunting to feed their families. Women also found work in professions traditionally dominated by men. Some became ranchers and cowgirls, working alongside men to herd cattle and manage large ranches. Others entered fields like medicine, becoming midwives, nurses, and even doctors at a time when formal medical care was scarce. Dr. Susan Anderson, for example, became one of the first female doctors in Colorado, traveling long distances on horseback to treat patients in remote settlements. In booming frontier towns, women established businesses, from general stores and saloons to hotels and boarding houses. Many women became successful entrepreneurs, like Mary Fields, an African-American woman who ran a mail route in Montana, earning a reputation for toughness and reliability. Women also worked in more controversial professions. Some found work as dance hall girls, while others became madams, running the brothels that were common in Western towns. Some of these women, like Madame Mustache in Nevada, became well-known figures in their communities, wielding significant influence despite the stigma attached to their profession. While many women sought to carve out honest lives, others took a different path. Some became outlaws, gamblers, or even gunslingers. Figures like Belle Starr gained notoriety as female bandits, while Pearl Hart made headlines for robbing a stagecoach in Arizona. Then there was Calamity Jane, a frontierswoman and sharpshooter who dressed like a man, fought alongside soldiers, and became a Wild West legend. These women lived outside the norms of society, proving that they could be just as daring and dangerous as their male counterparts. Women also played an important role in the fight for law and order in the West. Some became sheriffs or detectives like Mary Owens, one of the first female deputy sheriffs. Others worked behind the scenes, supporting their lawman husbands or helping bring criminals to justice. One of the most overlooked contributions of women in the West was their role in social reform and education. Many women worked as teachers, bringing literacy and knowledge to remote areas where schools were scarce. Others became activists, fighting for women's rights, Native American rights, and better living conditions. Esther Hobart Morris, for example, was instrumental in Wyoming becoming the first U.S. territory to grant women the right to vote in 1869, long before the rest of the country followed suit. Life for women in the West was undeniably challenging. They faced the dangers of childbirth without modern medicine, the threat of violence from outlaws or rival factions, and the daily struggle of survival in an unpredictable and often unforgiving environment. But their resilience, courage, and determination helped shape the West in ways that history often fails to acknowledge. These women were not passive observers of history. They were active participants, breaking barriers and proving that survival in the Wild West required more than just a quick draw point. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Wild West was the rapid rise and fall of its settlements. Throughout the 19th century, the discovery of gold, silver, and other valuable resources led to the creation of boomtowns, small settlements that exploded almost overnight with an influx of miners, traders, and fortune seekers. These towns promised wealth and opportunity, but just as quickly as they grew, many of them collapsed, becoming ghost towns, abandoned remnants of the past, left to decay in the harsh western landscape. The California Gold Rush of 1849 was one of the earliest and most famous catalysts for this boomtown phenomenon. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, thousands of prospectors from across the U.S. and even from overseas rushed to California, hoping to strike it rich. Towns like San Francisco and Sacramento grew from small outposts into thriving cities practically overnight. Similar gold rushes followed in places like Colorado, Nevada, and the Black Hills of South Dakota, each triggering a wave of settlers eager to claim their share of the riches. In these boom towns, law and order were often weak, and crime ran rampant. With so many people competing for wealth, disputes were common, and many towns saw violent shootouts, robberies, and lawless behavior. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels became central parts of the local economy, catering to miners who had struck it rich or lost everything. Many of these establishments were run by savvy businesspeople, including women, who saw the opportunity to profit from the chaotic nature of these frontier settlements. The layout of these boomtowns followed a predictable pattern. As more people arrived, simple wooden buildings and tent camps were replaced by more permanent structures. Banks, general stores, blacksmith shops, and hotels were built to support the growing population. The promise of jobs and commerce attracted not just miners, but also doctors, lawyers, teachers, and lawmen who sought to bring some level of order to these wild settlements. However, the prosperity of boomtowns rarely lasted. The moment the gold or silver veins ran dry, people packed up and left, seeking the next big strike elsewhere. Some towns, like Virginia City, Nevada, managed to transition into more stable settlements due to industries like ranching and tourism. Others, however, were completely abandoned, leaving behind empty buildings, crumbling storefronts, and eerie reminders of a once thriving community. One of the best-preserved examples of a ghost town today is Bodie, California, a former gold mining town that saw its peak in the late 1800s before being abandoned in the early 20th century. At its height, Bodie had a population of nearly 10,000, with banks, churches, schools, and even a Chinatown district. But as the gold supply dwindled and fires destroyed parts of the town, residents moved on, leaving behind buildings that still stand today, frozen in time. Boomtowns weren't just about gold and silver. Other industries also contributed to their rise and fall. The cattle industry led to the creation of many frontier towns that flourished during the height of the cattle drives in the mid-1800s. Towns like Dodge City, Kansas, and Abilene, Texas became notorious for their rowdy saloons, cowboys, and shootouts, fueled by the arrival of cattle herds that needed to be driven to railheads for transport east. However, as the railroad expanded and barbed wire fencing changed the nature of ranching, these cattle boomtowns either adapted or faded into obscurity. Similarly, railroad towns played a crucial role in shaping the West. As rail lines expanded across the frontier, small towns sprung up along the tracks, serving as refueling stations, supply hubs, or rest stops for weary travelers. Some of these towns, like Denver and Cheyenne, became major cities that still exist today, while others disappeared when railway routes changed or demand declined. Ghost towns stand as haunting reminders of the Wild West's fleeting nature. Many of them remain untouched, with rusting mining equipment, weathered buildings, and abandoned graveyards, symbols of dreams that were never fully realized. Some have become popular tourist attractions, while others lie forgotten, slowly being reclaimed by the desert or prairie landscapes around them. The cycle of boom and bust was an unavoidable part of life in the Old West. For many, the dream of striking it rich ended in disappointment, but for others, it was the foundation of new opportunities. These towns, both thriving and abandoned, tell the real story of the West, not just one of gunfights and adventure, but of ambition, risk, and the relentless pursuit of fortune. The construction of railroads was one of the most transformative forces in the Wild West. Before railroads, traveling across the vast and rugged frontier was a slow, dangerous, and exhausting journey. People relied on covered wagons, stagecoaches, and horseback travel, which could take weeks or even months to reach a destination. But with the expansion of rail lines in the mid to late 19th century, the American West changed forever, bringing both opportunities and challenges to the region. Perhaps the most significant development was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which connected the eastern United States to the Pacific coast. This massive engineering feat was accomplished by two competing railroad companies, the Union Pacific, which built westward from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific, which laid tracks eastward from Sacramento, California. Thousands of workers, including Irish immigrants, former Civil War soldiers, and a large number of Chinese laborers, endured grueling conditions, extreme weather, and dangerous work environments to complete the railroad. Before the railroad, a trip from the East Coast to California could take 6 months by wagon or several weeks by ship, often requiring a dangerous voyage around South America or across the disease-ridden jungles of Panama. The Transcontinental Railroad cut this travel time down to just 7 days, making it easier than ever for settlers, businesses, and supplies to move westward. With the arrival of railroads, boomtowns sprang up almost overnight, especially around rail depots, where passengers and goods could be loaded and unloaded. Towns like Cheyenne, Wyoming, Laramie, Wyoming, and Dodge City, Kansas became major railway hubs, attracting businesses, saloons, and settlers eager to take advantage of the newfound accessibility. However, not all of these towns lasted. Some, which depended entirely on railroad traffic, became ghost towns once rail lines were rerouted or shut down. One of the biggest economic impacts of the railroad was its effect on the cattle industry. Before the railroad, cowboys had to drive their herds on long cattle trails from Texas to railheads in Kansas and Nebraska, where the animals would be shipped to slaughterhouses in Chicago and other eastern cities. Railroads made this process faster and more efficient, allowing the cattle industry to expand rapidly. However, this boom also led to overgrazing, land disputes, and the eventual decline of the open-range cattle drives as ranchers began fencing off land with barbed wire. Railroads also played a significant role in Native American displacement. As tracks were laid across traditional native lands, the U.S. government pushed tribes onto reservations, often through force. The bison, which were essential to many plains tribes, were systematically slaughtered, both to clear the way for trains and to weaken native resistance. Hunting parties, often backed by railroad companies, killed millions of bison, reducing their population from an estimated 30 to 60 million to fewer than 1,000 by the late 1800s. Without their primary food source, many native tribes were forced to rely on government rations, making them more dependent and vulnerable to U.S. policies. Another major effect of the railroad was the rise of outlaws and train robbers. As trains transported gold, silver, and other valuables across the West, they became prime targets for criminal gangs. Famous outlaws like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the Dalton Gang, and Jesse James made names for themselves by robbing trains, often in daring and violent heists. These robberies added to the romanticized image of the Wild West, but in reality, they often resulted in brutal manhunts and deadly shootouts. The impact of railroads extended beyond transportation and economics. It also brought new technologies and communication advancements to the frontier. The telegraph was often built alongside rail lines, allowing for near-instant communication across vast distances. This had profound effects on business, law enforcement, and military operations, as information that once took weeks to deliver could now be transmitted in minutes. Despite their many benefits, railroads were also notorious for corruption and exploitation. Many railroad companies engaged in shady business practices, including bribing government officials for land grants and overcharging settlers for tickets and freight costs. The construction of rail lines often involved forced labor, poor working conditions, and discrimination, especially against Chinese and Irish workers who were paid significantly less than their white counterparts. Railroads fundamentally reshaped the West, turning it from an isolated frontier into an interconnected part of the United States. They facilitated migration, accelerated economic growth, and allowed cities to flourish where once there had only been wilderness. However, this progress came at a cost. Native American lands were taken, small ranchers and farmers were often driven out by powerful railroad companies, and the West's traditional way of life was forever altered. The Wild West is often depicted as a lawless land where outlaws roamed freely and gunfights erupted in the streets at the slightest provocation. While there was certainly violence and crime, the reality is that lawmen played a critical role in bringing order to the frontier. These law enforcement officers, sheriffs, marshals, Texas Rangers, and even private detectives worked tirelessly, often at great personal risk, to maintain peace in the rapidly growing and often chaotic settlements of the West. Law enforcement in the West was vastly different from the established police forces of the eastern United States. In many cases, newly formed towns had no formal justice system, which meant that lawmen often had to enforce the law based on personal judgment rather than clear legal codes. Early lawmen were typically elected or appointed by local governments or territorial authorities. Some were federal marshals, tasked with enforcing federal laws across vast, often inhospitable territories. Others were county sheriffs, responsible for keeping order in their jurisdictions, tracking down fugitives, and occasionally forming posses, groups of deputized civilians, to help apprehend criminals. One of the most famous lawmen of the Wild West was Wyatt Earp, known for his role in the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881 in Tombstone, Arizona. Earp, along with his brothers and his ally Doc Holliday, took on the outlaw Clanton McGlory gang in a shootout that became legendary. However, Earp was not the clean-cut hero often portrayed in movies. Like many lawmen of the time, he walked a fine line between enforcing the law and bending it to suit his own needs. Another iconic figure was Wild Bill Hickok, a former soldier and scout who became a marshal in Abilene, Kansas. Hickok was known for his sharp shooting and fearless demeanor, but his time as a lawman was short-lived, as he struggled to control the rowdy cowboys and gamblers that filled Abilene's saloons. He was eventually killed while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota, holding what is now called the dead man's hand, a pair of aces and eights. One of the biggest challenges lawmen faced was the sheer geography of the West. Unlike in the East, where cities were close together and law enforcement agencies were well established, Western lawmen often had to patrol vast areas with limited resources. A single sheriff might be responsible for an entire county covering hundreds of miles, with little backup available if trouble arose. This lack of support often forced lawmen to be creative in how they maintained order, sometimes relying on brutal force or extrajudicial measures to deal with repeat offenders. Outlaws were not the only threat to law and order in the West. Range wars between cattle ranchers and homesteaders, feuds between rival factions, and violent labor disputes all put enormous strain on local law enforcement. The infamous Lincoln County War in New Mexico, which involved figures like Billy the Kid, saw ranchers, businessmen, and hired gunmen battling for control of territory, leaving local sheriffs struggling to maintain control. At times, lawmen themselves were corrupt or became outlaws in disguise. Many Western towns were run by powerful business interests, and some sheriffs and marshals were little more than enforcers for wealthy ranchers, mining companies, or railroad corporations. Some lawmen even turned to crime themselves, using their badges as a shield for illegal activities. One infamous example was Henry Plummer, the sheriff of Bannack, Montana, who secretly led an outlaw gang responsible for robbing and murdering travelers. When his activities were exposed, he was hanged by vigilantes. In fact, vigilante justice was often a major part of law enforcement in the Wild West. Because official law enforcement was often slow to arrive in new settlements, many frontier towns formed vigilante committees, groups of armed citizens who took it upon themselves to punish criminals. While some vigilantes helped maintain order in places where lawmen were ineffective, others became little more than lynch mobs, using their power to settle personal grudges or target marginalized groups. Another key player in Western law enforcement was the Texas Rangers, an elite group of lawmen established in the early 19th century. Unlike local sheriffs, the Rangers operated across the entire state of Texas, tracking down bandits, fighting Native American tribes, and enforcing the law in remote regions. They were famous for their toughness and relentless pursuit of criminals, but they were also controversial, sometimes acting as hired guns for powerful landowners or engaging in violent conflicts with Mexican and Native American communities. Private detective agencies also played a role in law enforcement, particularly in cases where traditional lawmen were unable or unwilling to act. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was one of the most famous, hunting down notorious outlaws like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy. The Pinkertons were well-funded and well-trained, but they were also ruthless, often using violent methods and even spying on labor unions on behalf of wealthy business owners. The battle to bring law and order to the Wild West was never easy. Lawmen faced overwhelming odds, from well-armed gangs to politically connected criminals. Despite their efforts, violence and crime remained a constant reality in many frontier towns. However, their presence and actions, both heroic and controversial, helped lay the foundation for the more structured legal systems that eventually replaced the lawless frontier. The Wild West is often remembered as a land of cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws, but women played a crucial role in shaping the frontier. Whether as pioneers, ranchers, business owners, outlaws, or sharpshooters, women in the West had a profound impact on its development. They faced harsh conditions, defied traditional gender roles, and contributed to the survival and growth of Western communities. While history has often overlooked their contributions, these women were just as resilient, daring, and influential as their male counterparts. One of the most important roles women played in the West was that of the pioneer wife and homesteader. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged families to move westward by offering them land in exchange for farming and development. Women were essential to the success of these homesteads, managing farms, raising livestock, and ensuring that families could survive in harsh environments. They performed grueling labor, including plowing fields, preserving food, making clothing, and even defending their land from attacks by bandits or hostile forces. In many cases, women took over farms or businesses entirely when their husbands died or were away on cattle drives. Some women defied the expectations of society and became ranchers, cowgirls, and even gunfighters. While the cowboy life is typically associated with men, many women in the West learned how to ride, rope, and shoot just as well. Some, like Annie Oakley, gained fame for their incredible marksmanship. Oakley, a world-famous sharpshooter, performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and demonstrated her unmatched shooting skills across America and Europe. She shattered stereotypes by proving that women could be just as skilled with firearms as men. Other women gained notoriety as outlaws. Perhaps the most famous female outlaw of the West was Belle Starr, who is known for her association with Jesse James and other criminals. Starr became infamous as the Bandit Queen and was rumored to have been involved in horse theft, robbery, and smuggling. Another well-known outlaw was Pearl Hart, who became famous for robbing a stagecoach in Arizona in 1899. Women like these defied the law and lived dangerously, making them legendary figures in Western folklore. While some women turned to crime, others took up roles in law enforcement or became detectives and spies. Calamity Jane, a rough-talking, gunslinging frontierswoman, worked as a scout for the U.S. Army and was known for her close association with Wild Bill Hickok. Though her life became the subject of exaggerated stories, she played a real role in the development of the West. Many women found opportunity in the West as entrepreneurs and business owners. In frontier towns, women often ran boarding houses, general stores, restaurants, and saloons. Some, like Madame Mustache, became famous gamblers who made a living from the high-stakes world of Western gambling. Others, like Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary, worked in traditionally male-dominated jobs. Fields was the first African-American woman to work as a mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service in the West, often delivering mail on dangerous routes with a gun at her side. Women also played a significant role in education, healthcare, and social reform. In many growing towns, it was women who established the first schools, churches, and hospitals. Teachers were among the first settlers in new communities, ensuring that children received an education. Nurses and midwives were essential in an era when medical care was scarce, often delivering babies and treating injuries with limited supplies. One of the most famous women in this regard was Dr. Susan Law Flesh Picot, the first Native American woman to become a physician. She dedicated her life to improving healthcare for both Native and non-Native communities in Nebraska. Additionally, many women in the West were involved in activism and political change. The Western Territories were among the first to grant women the right to vote. Wyoming became the first state to allow women to vote in 1869, long before women had the right to vote nationwide. This was due in part to the fact that women in the West were seen as equal contributors to society, working alongside men to build homes, businesses, and governments. Many early female politicians and suffragists emerged from the West, helping to shape the future of women's rights in America. Women of color also played significant roles in the development of the West. African American women, often former slaves, migrated west seeking freedom and opportunity. Many of them became homesteaders, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. Native American women fought to preserve their cultures and traditions in the face of westward expansion and displacement. Women like Lawless, a warrior of the Apache tribe, played an active role in resisting U.S. forces and protecting her people. Hispanic and Mexican women also contributed as ranchers, traders, and political activists, ensuring their communities thrived even amid cultural and territorial changes. Despite their many contributions, life was far from easy for women in the West. They endured harsh conditions, legal discrimination, and limited rights. Many had little access to health care, and in remote areas, they faced isolation and hardship. However, their resilience and determination helped shape the frontier, leaving behind a legacy that challenges the traditional image of the Wild West as a man's world. The story of the Wild West cannot be told without acknowledging the experiences of the Native American tribes who lived on the land long before the arrival of European settlers. For centuries, indigenous nations thrived across the vast landscapes of North America, developing rich cultures, traditions, and societies deeply connected to the land. However, the westward expansion of settlers, fueled by government policies, military campaigns, and economic ambitions, led to a tragic and violent chapter in American history. Native Americans fought to defend their homelands, their way of life, and their very survival against an overwhelming force that sought to push them aside. One of the greatest threats to Native American life was the steady encroachment of settlers onto their lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, had already forced many eastern tribes, such as the Cherokee and Creek, to relocate west of the Mississippi River along the infamous Trail of Tears. However, as the U.S. expanded further westward in the mid to late 19th century, Native tribes found themselves in constant conflict with the federal government, land-hungry settlers, and railroad companies that saw indigenous lands as obstacles to progress. One of the most devastating blows to Native American culture was the destruction of the buffalo, which had been the lifeblood of many Plains tribes. The bison provided food, clothing, shelter, and tools for tribes such as the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche. However, with the arrival of the railroads and commercial hunting, the buffalo were slaughtered in the millions, often deliberately, as part of a government-backed effort to starve Native communities into submission. By the late 1800s, a species that once roamed the plains in numbers of 30 to 60 million had been reduced to fewer than 1,000, forcing many tribes into a state of dependency on government rations. Despite these hardships, Native American warriors fiercely resisted U.S. expansion. Some of the most legendary figures of the West emerged from this struggle, including Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo. These leaders organized their people and fought back against military campaigns designed to force them onto reservations. One of the most well-known conflicts was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, decisively defeated General George Custer and his 7th Cavalry. This battle, often called Custer's Last Stand, was a rare but significant victory for Native Americans. However, it also led to increased military retaliation, with the U.S. government determined to crush indigenous resistance once and for all. Many Native nations were forced onto reservations, which were often located on poor-quality land far from their ancestral homes. The reservation system was designed to strip indigenous people of their traditional ways of life and assimilate them into Western culture. The Dawes Act of 1887 further weakened Native sovereignty by dividing tribal land into individual plots and selling off excess land to white settlers. This not only disrupted communal living but also resulted in the loss of millions of acres of indigenous land. The Native resistance movement continued into the late 19th century, culminating in the tragic massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. After years of forced removals, broken treaties, and cultural suppression, the Lakota people turned to the ghost dance movement, a spiritual movement that promised the return of the buffalo and the restoration of their lands. Fearing an uprising, U.S. troops surrounded a group of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota and opened fire, killing over 250 men, women, and children. This massacre marked the effective end of armed Native resistance in the West, symbolizing the brutal consequences of U.S. expansion. Yet, even as they faced immense challenges, Native Americans fought to preserve their cultural identity and traditions. Many resisted assimilation policies by holding onto their languages, spiritual practices, and customs despite government efforts to eradicate them through boarding schools, where Native children were forced to abandon their heritage. These schools, which operated under the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," sought to strip children of their Native identities by forbidding them from speaking their languages or practicing their customs. While the Wild West is often portrayed as a place of freedom and opportunity for Native Americans, it was a period of immense suffering, betrayal, and resilience. Their fight for survival continues to this day, as many indigenous communities work to reclaim their lands, preserve their languages, and educate future generations about their true history, one that is far more complex and significant than the myths often told about the American frontier. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was one of the most transformative events in the history of the American West. Before the railroad, travel across the continent was an arduous and often deadly journey. Settlers, traders, and gold seekers had to endure months of travel by wagon, horseback, or foot, facing extreme weather, hostile terrain, and the constant threat of attack. The completion of the railroad changed everything, linking the eastern and western parts of the country, revolutionizing commerce, immigration, and the very landscape of the frontier. Before the railroad, the primary routes westward were trails such as the Oregon Trail, California Trail, and Santa Fe Trail. These paths were dangerous, often resulting in starvation, disease, or violent encounters with outlaws and Native American tribes who saw the settlers as invaders. The discovery of gold in California, 1848, and the promise of open land drew thousands to the west, but there was no efficient way to transport people or goods quickly. The idea of a railroad stretching across the country became a national priority, not only to promote economic expansion but also to assert U.S. control over the vast, untamed frontier. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, authorizing the construction of a transcontinental railroad. Two companies, the Union Pacific, building westward from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific, building eastward from Sacramento, California, were given the task of laying the tracks that would unite the nation. To encourage rapid progress, the government provided massive land grants and financial incentives, giving the companies ownership of land along the railroad that they could sell to settlers. The construction of the railroad was a monumental undertaking, requiring thousands of workers to labor through some of the harshest conditions imaginable. The Union Pacific, moving westward, relied heavily on Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and African American workers who laid track across the Great Plains. The Central Pacific, moving eastward, faced an even greater challenge as they had to blast through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains. They employed Chinese immigrants, who became the backbone of the workforce. These Chinese laborers worked long hours for low wages, often performing the most dangerous tasks, including handling explosives to carve tunnels through solid rock. Despite their immense contributions, they faced extreme discrimination and violence from white settlers and workers. On May 10, 1869, the two rail lines met at Promontory Summit, Utah, where a ceremonial golden spike was driven into the ground to mark the railroad's completion. For the first time, it was possible to travel from New York to San Francisco in just a week, rather than the months-long, treacherous journey by wagon. This achievement was widely celebrated as a symbol of progress, unity, and American ingenuity, but its impact was far more complex than the simple narrative of national triumph suggests. The completion of the railroad had devastating consequences for Native American tribes. The once isolated plains and mountain regions were now accessible to settlers, soldiers, and commercial enterprises eager to exploit the land. The railroad companies actively promoted westward migration by selling land and advertising the frontier as a land of opportunity. As a result, indigenous tribes saw their territories shrink rapidly, their hunting grounds disappear, and their way of life come under relentless attack. The railroad also enabled the mass slaughter of the buffalo, a deliberate strategy to force Native Americans onto reservations by cutting off their primary source of food and resources. The railroad also gave rise to boomtowns and ghost towns. As tracks pushed westward, settlements sprang up almost overnight along the route, catering to railroad workers, traders, and travelers. Some of these towns, such as Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Denver, Colorado, grew into major cities, while others, once the construction crews moved on, were abandoned and became ghost towns. These railroad towns were often lawless, filled with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels, attracting both fortune seekers and criminals. The railroad further transformed the economy of the West. It made it possible to transport cattle, minerals, and agricultural goods to eastern markets, fueling industries such as cattle ranching and mining. The famous cattle drives of Texas and Kansas, which had previously relied on long, hazardous trails, became far more efficient with access to rail lines. Cowboys could now herd cattle to railheads like Dodge City or Abilene, where they would be shipped to slaughterhouses in Chicago and beyond. The Transcontinental Railroad also had a profound impact on the culture and demographics of the West. The promise of fast transportation attracted immigrants from around the world, particularly Chinese, Irish, and German settlers, who played key roles in building the railroad and populating new settlements. However, as immigration increased, so did racial tensions. Chinese workers, despite their contributions, faced violence, exclusionary laws, and the eventual Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which severely restricted their ability to live and work in the United States. Despite its controversies and hardships, the railroad undeniably shaped the destiny of the American West. It brought the frontier into the modern era, allowing for rapid expansion, economic growth, and technological progress. Yet it also came at a heavy price: displacement of indigenous peoples, environmental destruction, and the exploitation of immigrant labor. The railroad is one of the most powerful symbols of both the triumph and tragedy of the Wild West.